Yes.
And this, I think, is a very nice follow-up question. Irene Crowder from the Viken Rasmussen Foundation. When you're sitting with your CEOs, when you're sitting with your leadership of your companies, how long a time frame are you able to have on these issues? We learned from the IPCC report, A Small Leak, in August, that there probably will be agreement on 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And that's a very, we know from the way IPCC has been developing the next report, this is a very conservative estimate, probably. How long time are you sitting talking about when you are talking risk? What does resilience really mean to you in that sense?
Great. I'll be glad to start. So as I mentioned, Sandy was last October 29th. God forbid it hit again this October 29th. It would be better. It would be better. But unfortunately, it would be very similar to what we saw last year. I think the challenge is if it hits us in October 29th of 2018 or 2023, will it be dramatically better and will it be a lot different than what we saw this past year? So it's not a one-year solution. We absolutely would love to see that. Our systems are very large. You know, they've taken us, in many cases, 100 years to build. To now reinforce and make those systems more resilient takes many, many years, and it really takes a long-term plan. When we look at our capital plan, just in the state of New York, we spend about $1 billion. If you look at the mix of how much of that is now dedicated towards resiliency, it's much higher than it would have been just a year or two ago. But we also have a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 15-year plan, and unfortunately, it'll probably be the whole of that 15-year plan whereby any one of us could ever get up in front of a group and say, hey, we believe we've mitigated the bulk of these risks. So I think the key is finding out where you have the most risk, whether it's a hospital, whether it's low-lying areas, whether it's your own critical infrastructure, and making your initial investments targeted towards those regions, and then having a plan and hopefully having the right regulation, the right government partnership that facilitates investment, that encourages innovation, new technologies, so that by the time you get to the 5, 10, even the 15-year horizon, it really is a different landscape, and the systems we've built are not just resilient for the last 100 years, but much more so for the next 100 years.
Within Rio Tinto, our risk management committee meets on a quarterly basis, and as I mentioned, climate is one of the key risks for the company, and so it gets talked about at virtually every meeting. Certainly from a bottoms-up approach at a site level, our business resilience and recovery plans are reviewed on an annual basis. If there's an event, then they're updated post that event. So across our entire company, there's an ongoing dialogue about these issues. But you ask a very good question about how much time should we be spending on this versus all the other business issues that we have to deal with. And I'm not sure I have a very good answer for you. A lot of these risks are far out in the future for us. I mean, yes, a 3-foot sea level rise will affect our ports, but frankly, by then we will have probably rebuilt these ports a couple of times. For me, the more interesting question is, as I mentioned, since I'm responsible for designing and building projects for the company, what should I build for the future? How do we answer that question?
If the question really went to what duration do we look out to when we're doing our planning, so I would say for our company, most of our strategic planning, our business planning is much, much shorter term. It's 3 to 5 years. But the way the longer term impacts our business is we have to model for weather events, and our models look at 1 in 100-year events and 1 in 250-year events. So from that standpoint, the models that are being produced very, very much looking out, and also then trying to say, okay, if 5 years ago we projected X, the learning from the last 4 years, how much should that change the projection? So with respect to that component, meaning our pricing and our risk appetite, we have to look out longer.
Keep giving the microphone away. Lisa Friedman, hi, thank you. I write for Climate Wire. We're an energy policy magazine in DC. And thanks, everybody, for doing this. My question, I guess, is for any of you, or even maybe Eileen as well. I was wondering if some of you could speak about the challenges that still seem to exist in getting businesses engaged on resilience or adaptation, whatever we're calling it now. I still see a lot of the same industries, reinsurance industry, of course, a lot of the same companies like Rio Tinto that are really out in front on this issue. The report that you talked about, 20-something of the companies that you cited are actively taking climate change into consideration. What are the challenges that you still face, even in the face of all of these, storms and extreme weather events? Or is it that things are really changing and businesses just aren't calling it climate change and I'm not seeing it? Or, are there still some really big hurdles that you face in getting businesses engaged on this issue?
Let's see, maybe I'll just start at the very top here. I think you can actually have conversations about resilience and resilience planning with people with whom you cannot have conversations about climate change. So in other words, there are people who understand that you actually do have extreme weather events. There are probably more of them. They have to deal with them in one way or another, even if they're not willing to say, I accept the science and let's see what the science takes us. So it can be a different conversation with a different group of people. And I think that's possible, whereas to some companies or politicians, you go in and you say, I want to talk to you about climate change, and actually, in some cases, you can't get in the door because they just don't want to deal with it. But if you want to talk about building resilience, you actually might be able to have a conversation. So it does change the way people will talk about it, and it will change the way they do certain kinds of things, but not everything.
I'd offer one comment. So we're a leading provider of insurance to small businesses, and I referenced the study that we did of small businesses. So I think it's getting people to act on the realizations that they have. So I give you an example of when we asked the small business owners what would they have done differently given what they went through with the storm. They say, review our insurance coverage to make sure we have the right coverage. Make sure we have backup for our data because we lost our data. Make sure we have a generator. How many small business owners are actually going to do that after the storm is passed? You could ask yourself the same question about your home and what steps you do or don't take. They are extraordinarily busy. The economy has been stressful for them. And so I'd say getting them to take the realization of the moment and act on it is a challenge.
I think economics comes in as well. If you remember the energy trilemma, the affordable aspect, again, especially in a down economy, take a homeowner on Staten Island or in Lindenhurst, Long Island, pre-Sandy, they probably had a home worth, let's say $400,000, and they were living the American dream, and maybe the mortgage was $200,000, everything was fine. Now the floodwaters come in, the house that used to be worth $400 is only worth $200. And in order to get it to even be worth $200, they need to put $100 in it just to raise it and to make it resilient and to get back up and running. And I think a lot of them will do it, and they're trying to make it work, but it's hard because of the price tag that goes with these types of things. And if you look at businesses, it's the same thing. Do you make the investment after it's happened when you already realize you missed the last one? Or do you use your incremental resource to address all the other challenges? I think the thing I would say on the positive is it's for real now. People aren't just hearing Al Gore talk about it, right? We all saw it in its raw, brutal way during Sandy and during these other weather events, that all these, same businesses who perhaps previously had it as part of the plan, but were not actioning it, have now moved it up and they're doing things about it. It's just that there are constraints in terms of their financial resources as to how best to address it.
And I guess I can only echo Eileen's comments about reframing the debate in other terms. So I gave an example of our idle reduction program at our Kennecott mine in Utah. Yes, it reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but it also saves fuel and saves money and extends equipment life and has some other benefits as well in terms of other pollutant emissions. So we try to frame the debate in other ways, and we frankly have gotten some companies on board to that idle reduction program who are still vehement climate deniers.
Yeah. Oh, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Nicole Nicole Gelinas from the Manhattan Institute. I have a question for Preston exactly about that, the idling trucks. How do you make sure that this happens? Is this voluntary where they want to participate, or did you have to invest in equipment that says, this guy has been still for a long time and he has his engine on?
Yeah. There's a small monitoring device that we put on each vehicle, and it records the operation of the equipment, and if it sits idle for more than our specified period, it signals an alert, and it sends a signal back to our control center, and we can get on the radio and say, why are you just sitting there with the engine running? So, I mean, it's real time.
I've got a short question. What are the odds of a national carbon tax by the end of the decade?
That's right. That's right up Eileen. She's.
I'd like to think so. Do I have to?
Which decade?
Joe?
Hi, Courtney White from the Rainforest Alliance, and I work with youth internationally, and we work on MRED projects in Guatemala, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and then here in the U.S. work with students in K through 8. And I'm just wondering on your training programs, what your learning curve is in terms of the knowledge gap around climate science, understanding the carbon cycle. You know, that once carbon's in the atmosphere, it takes several hundreds of years before it cycles out, which is why we're getting this fluctuation in part with the downpours and droughts. So can you talk a little bit about the differentiated local needs for training? Because there's no one size fits all with your national and multinational companies. So internally, how are you kind of creating this training or structuring so that the internal learning curve is optimizing your ability to succeed in your businesses?
You know, I'll answer with a personal example and then give you a corporate program. You know, the personal example is, so for most of my life, I've lived here in New York City, and if you think of New York City's garbage collection, just a simple example, for most people, you pick up the regular garbage twice a week, and then the recycles once a week, or at some points it was once every 2 weeks. If you live in Long Island, it's the regular garbage, in some cases 3 times a week, and the recycles only once a week. For the 2 years I lived in England, the regular garbage only came once a week, the recycles came twice a week, and the food waste, they would come whenever you wanted. They'd come every day if need be. So part of it is, you know, education, but it's changing the behaviors, and it's coming up with programs that, you know, encourage conservation and encourage sustainability. In terms of the learning curve, we're finding that, you know, the next generation is actually much quicker than we were to pick up a lot of these concepts. Where we see the huge gaps is around the STEM disciplines, the math and the science, you know, engineering, et cetera. And I think that's where most of our focus is, to try to get, you know, our students, certainly, again, as I said earlier, university level, but much, much earlier, first interested in these topics, and then properly trained so that by the time they come into industry, they can make a meaningful contribution to some of these challenges.
Within RIO, we don't have a holistic program to train employees or even people in our local communities specifically around climate issues, but we do cover the broader range of sustainable development issues. So I talked earlier about water. We have water targets, we have energy use targets, we have emissions targets, we have biodiversity targets, you know, net positive impact on biodiversity at our mine sites. And we tend to tailor those to the needs of the specific site. So obviously, if we're in Madagascar, we're talking about lemurs and phosas and, you know, animals that are and flora that are unique to that environment, and also how to work with the local community about what should we restore to native vegetation and what should we bring back as perhaps plantations that they can use to harvest and make money and use that for cooking fuel rather than cutting down the untouched forest. So it's really sort of horses for courses for us. We try to tailor the programs specifically to those communities or environments where we're operating.
For us, I think we're heavily dependent upon our actuaries, statisticians to take the data and kind of make sense of it and build projections on it. And I think we've got a pretty good pipeline there, bringing people in. They're not necessarily climatologists, but they're very, very heavily mathematicians.
Hi, I'm Rick Love from United Technologies. It's a question for all of you. Compared to, say, 3 years ago, in your corporate enterprise risk management process, do you now have more risk indicators relative to climate than you did maybe 3 years ago? And if so, are any of them shorter term than perhaps they were 3 years ago? 3 to 5 years ago. I guess basically, are you seeing it as a shorter term issue with broader implications than you did, again, perhaps 3 or 5 years ago?
So I would say for us, yes, but principally in the area of our natural catastrophe modeling with respect to our product. And so not the impact on our facilities or our operations, but around whether we have the right risk aggregation of properties in different locations in the event of extreme weather events.
I would say we are trying to get more granular in the data. I mean, 5 years ago, I think it was about 5 years ago, we were basically using the IPCC AR3 data to estimate impacts on future operations. Then we went to the Hadley Center and we had them do some work for us for a couple of years. Now we're using the University of Oklahoma to try to hone down the scale of the prediction efforts so that we can, rather than sort of an entire country or a region, now we're down to local regions where we're trying to predict impacts and effects. So in that sense, it's gotten more granular, but more broadly, I would say the discussion is similar to 3 to 5 years ago.
Yeah, I would say when you look at our risk management and our risk scoring, the number one item is always a catastrophic failure, where we lose the ability to serve, our customers, particularly large groups of those customers or critical facilities. And that's always been the number one risk, and we've always tried to mitigate against it. I think what's different now is the frequency of challenges on our ability to do so. So if you just go back, a decade, 8 or 9 of the 10 we've seen this past decade, the attacks on our system, 8 or 9 have been weather-related, climate-related. We're really only one, and that was when the entire Northeast went out. The Northeast blackout back in 2003 was caused by something other than weather. So it's increased in the frequency and the intensity. Having said that, it's always been the number one focus of our risk management approach.
I don't see any hands, so I would like to thank Ken, Preston, and Alan. I think you guys did
Thank
a
you.
great job.